building this bridge, claiming Crimea as part of the Russian motherland. It's his own sort of prestige project. So to attack it is poking Putin in the eye to some degree, and also showing that the Ukrainians have got this ability, which they've demonstrated by attacking Russian oil refineries over the border in Russia in recent times, that they can sort of mount these kind of strikes and take the war to Russia as much as, if not as much, but at least to the extent that Russia has been taking the war to them, of course, since last February.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kerch Bridge. And today we are joined by a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for NATO with 38 years experience as a member of the Alliance's international staff. Dr. Jamie Shea has been a spokesperson for 3 Secretary Generals, and he's now a Professor of Strategy and Security at the University of Exeter. Dr. Shea, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Frontline. And as we're talking, it is the week when the Kerch Bridge linking Crimea to Russia has been targeted for a second time. Early reports suggesting it was by sea drones. And Russia is also saying that it has thwarted drones that were targeting Crimea. How serious do you think this is?
Well, certainly the Ukrainians are convinced that Kerch Bridge is being used to move military supplies across into Crimea, which the Russians, since they occupied it in 2014, have turned into something of a military fortress, certainly an arms depot for their current operations in Ukraine. So that means that the Ukrainians see it as a legitimate military target. They've always made that clear, even if, of course, you also have a lot of commercial traffic and even Russian holidaymakers using the bridge to go on holiday in Crimea. They attacked it, Kate, you remember, a couple of months back when they had a truck bomb on the bridge, which succeeded in causing quite a lot of damage. Damage this time round seems to be much more slight. The Russians claim that they've been able to reopen the bridge and it won't be fully prepared until November. So for Ukraine, it's a highly symbolic target because this is Putin's great masterstroke since he annexed Crimea, building this bridge, claiming Crimea as part of the Russian motherland. It's his own sort of prestige project. So to attack it is poking Putin in the eye to some degree, and also showing that the Ukrainians have got this ability, which they've demonstrated by attacking Russian oil refineries over the border in Russia in recent times, that they can sort of mount these kind of strikes and take the war to Russia as much as, if not as much, but at least to the extent that Russia has been taking the war to them, of course, since last February.
And contrasting with that, the gains made by Ukraine on the ground are painstakingly slow. How much pressure is there for Ukraine to demonstrate a strategic breakthrough before the summer is out?
I think, Kate, there's a lot of pressure because, of course, this spring offensive, which has turned into a summer offensive, given that it started rather late, has been hyped for a long time as the decisive moment. And the West, of course, has made a big effort over the last 6 months to supply Ukraine with the weapons that it's been calling for. Most recently, the Americans, of course, with the cluster munitions, but, tanks, the artillery, the long-range artillery, the air defense, the greater supplies of ammunition, 155 millimeters. So the West has made a big effort to arm Ukraine in the belief that this big effort would be vindicated with Ukraine being able to advance and maybe not liberate all of its territory, but to give the Russians a bloody nose and to really sort of push back and then be in a stronger position at the negotiating table. If the offensive doesn't succeed, of course, what is the definition of success? We'll need to talk about that. I don't ever think that anybody thought the Ukrainians in one stroke would liberate all of their territory, but there was a kind of anticipation, Kate, after last year when they had successes around Kherson and in the north around Kharkiv, that they had the ability to push the Russians back. Now, if it doesn't go well, then the West is in a difficult position because it's been supplying the Ukrainians from stocks so far, the stuff you have in your garage, if you like, which you can quickly transfer. But if there's going to be an offensive next year, then the West is going to have to produce industrially a lot of these weapons to resupply Ukraine, and that's going to be a very expensive proposition indeed. And there may, yes, sorry for this long answer, but yes, there may well be some people who start saying, well, look, the Ukrainians can't really hit back against entrenched Russian positions, so let's sort of call it a day and try to figure out some kind of compromise peace.
What do you think constitutes enough progress before the autumn comes?
Well, so far the Ukrainians claim that they've managed to seize back about 150 square miles, which is not inconsiderate, but it's in little patches along the front. There's not been any sort of decisive breakthrough, for example, recapturing Bakhmut or pushing back into the Donbass or, for example, gaining control of Zaporizhzhia, and particularly that important nuclear power station there that's caused all of us so much anxiety. I think what Western strategists would like to see would be a push in the south, out of Kherson towards Crimea, because we started off talking about the bridge, which is this important symbolic prize for Putin. And if the Ukraine were able to recapture Crimea from Russia, the prize of 2014, rather than the territory occupied after 2021, that would really be a humiliation for Putin, which might weaken him inside Russia and at least force him to probably withdraw entirely from the country. So something against Crimea, I think, has been what a lot of Western strategists would like. But again, the Russians are not silly. They've anticipated all of this, and they've dug themselves into very strong fortified positions, which, as in the First World War, it cost a lot of men, a lot of material, a lot of time to take, inch by inch and meter by meter. It's slow progress.
And throw into the mix, though, you have reports now of increasing defiance towards senior commanders amongst the Russian forces, of officers being dismissed, disappearing, dying. Commanders like Major General Ivan Popov dismissed for daring to be critical. And where is the former Supreme Commander Sergei Surovikin? I mean, is this an opportunity for Ukraine?
Well, my sense is that had this sort of a coup in a teacup, as I called it, a couple of weeks ago by Prigozhin and his Wagner group, had they succeeded in going all the way to Moscow and actually initiating some serious street fighting in Moscow, Putin would have been obliged to withdraw quite significant forces from Ukraine in order to protect his own regime. For example, airborne units, which are among the Russian elite, guards divisions and the like. And that would have given Ukrainians quite a significant opportunity. But, for all of the reasons we can discuss, Prigozhin threw in the towel, gave up, and withdrew. Putin was not obliged to draw down his forces from Ukraine, but said there were some Chechen fighters under Kadyrov for a short period. And so the Ukrainians really didn't get the big breakthrough, the hole in the front line, if you like, that they were hoping for. Now, it's true that the Russians are accredited with low morale. Popov, the general this week, who was fired after criticizing what was going on. There have been dissensions. Putin has changed commanders several times already, including recently firing the general who was in charge of logistics, not Popov, but another one as well. So all is not well. But on the other hand, even low morale Russian forces have put up a strong fight. We have to give them credit. They are currently at Kupiansk, around Kharkiv, launching a counter-offensive, which has put the Ukrainians now in that area on the defensive. They've dug themselves into well-fortified positions, and it's easier for the Russians to defend defended positions, where also they have air cover as well. So I'm the last person to write off even a badly led, low morale Russian army, precisely because the Russians have got mass. A few days ago, the defense minister, Shoigu, was boasting that they have 12 million soldiers in the reserves, which they could potentially draw upon. They've just called up another 150,000 conscripts into the forces. So, yes, Napoleon famously said that in war, the morale to the material is to 3-1. He's right, but if the Ukrainians can provide 3, but the Russians can provide 10 when it comes to mass, then it doesn't really help simply to have a lot of good motivation, a lot of skill on the Ukrainian side. You need to be able to deal with the Russian mass. So I would say that if they're attacking, that morale would be a weakness for them, but defending, it's far less so.
We've just had the NATO summit in Vilnius. We know there is no timetable for Ukraine to join the alliance, but it will join at some point. How successful do you think this summit has been for Ukraine?
Well, the Ukrainians went into it making lots of noises about unhappiness and dissatisfaction, particularly President Zelensky, who criticized NATO for not being ready to extend an invitation to Ukraine in Vilnius to join NATO there and then, or at least make a commitment on a date as soon as the war was over. NATO tried very hard to put together a package to convince Zelensky that although he didn't get everything he wanted, nonetheless, NATO was moving the cursor forward. And after the summit, he sounded a lot more positive. I think one thing that he particularly appreciated was the fact that the UK and a number of other countries in the so-called G7 had, in a separate meeting in Vilnius, on the sidelines of the NATO summit, had promised to give him so-called security guarantees, which is a kind of long-term commitment to train and finance the Ukrainian army well beyond the current war, to build it up into a long-term defense and deterrent force vis-a-vis Russia. NATO also made it clear that Ukraine is going to become a member one day. It set up a NATO-Russia Council. It set up a fund to help the Ukrainians achieve interoperability. And it also cancelled for Ukraine a so-called membership action plan, which, similar to the process of joining the EU, Kate, is this quite convoluted program of having to go through all kinds of tests to meet certain criteria before you can join NATO. And that could take up to 10 years. And NATO said, OK, in the case of Ukraine, we're scrapping that, which means that the Ukrainians, I think, got a signal that once the war is over, they will be fast-tracked into NATO very quickly. And so I think Zelensky, quite rightly, because where else does he go if he doesn't go to NATO and the Americans and the Allies? Who else is going to support him? I think Zelensky decided that to upset your friends is far worse than upsetting your enemies, and that he decided to put a brave face on things. But my sense after Vilnius is that, NATO taking in Ukraine is now inevitable. It's simply a question of timing.
But don't you think the takeaway from Vilnius for President Putin is keep the war going as long as possible so Ukraine can't join NATO?
I think you're absolutely right, Kate. I think there are two sort of issues that arise from the way NATO framed the decision. The first is the one you mentioned. Yes, Putin could say, well, look, if the Ukrainians join NATO the day after the war ends, I'll make sure the war never ends. And I think the problem for NATO is going to be that we're unlikely to see a perfect peace between Ukraine and Russia. We may see a ceasefire. We may see a return to what was once called a frozen conflict, although there was nothing particularly frozen about it. That low intensity conflict that we had in the Donbass after Russia encouraged separatists in that area after it annexed Crimea in 2014. And that before the full-blown war broke out in 2022, still killed 15,000 people and led to hundreds of thousands of refugees. So it's easy for Russia, as it's done in Georgia, as it's done in Moldova, to keep up that kind of low-intensity warfare. So if NATO says to Ukraine, we can only admit you once you have a perfect peace with Russia, this could drag on for many decades. So I think your question is exactly right. The question for NATO is under what circumstances can it take Ukraine in? Obviously, it can't be the current conflict, because that would mean that NATO goes to war with Russia immediately. There has to be some kind of peace agreement and de-escalation first. But it also means that NATO can't be held hostage to Putin. Putin may say, oh, well, I'll fire a couple of shells over the border today just to show that hostilities are still going on and prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. That would put the decision not in Ukraine's hands or NATO's hands, but in Putin's hands. So I've called it, in some of my own reflections, the West Berlin scenario. West Berlin during the Cold War was part of NATO with NATO security guarantees, even though, think of Checkpoint Charlie and the Berlin crises in the early 60s, there was often quite a lot of tension between the Soviet Union and the West. But it didn't prevent West Berlin from being protected by NATO. So something along those lines, I think, is going to be called for. Otherwise, as I said, Ukraine will be in the waiting room for generations to come.
NATO has been criticised for being slow to act and weak in its judgment over Ukraine. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree. It's a big thing if you're president of the United States to, on the one hand, push back against Russia for its egregious behavior, naked aggression. Nobody disputes that. But at the same time, not get your country involved in a nuclear war with Russia. If you're a responsible politician, you don't start doing reckless things that are going to lead to potentially a new world war. So I do understand NATO looking at this very deliberately. The other thing, to be perfectly frank, as a NATO official, I dealt with Ukraine for many years, is Ukraine was not ready to join NATO. The Ukraine of President Zelensky, this plucky country which has resisted so well, is not the Ukraine I knew back 20 years ago when it had problems with corruption, freedom of the media, oligarchs, getting on with economic reform and all of the rest. It still had a lot of hoops to go through, quite frankly. And even today, the United States has made it clear that simply for Ukraine to achieve interoperability in a military sense with NATO is not sufficient. Ukraine still has to demonstrate after the war that it will remain united, that it will get on with fighting corruption. Billions and billions of dollars and euros are going to flow into Ukraine to reconstruct the country after the war. And you don't want half of that ending up in Swiss bank accounts, obviously, through corruption. So I think, being deliberate and being cautious is the right thing to do. You want to bring Ukraine into the alliance in a way that stabilizes the situation in Europe, not in a way that makes a conflict with Russia inevitable in the short term.
And how strong do you think the alliance's judgment is over China, and how much has it had to reevaluate its position since the war in Ukraine, do you think?
Well, I think NATO has been disappointed, obviously, in the way in which China has supported the Russian narrative, at least in its public discourse. And some reports that the Chinese, contrary to what they say in public, have been supplying Russia, with weapons, not necessarily complete jet fighter systems and tanks, but certainly with ammunition and electronic components and explosives, chemicals to produce explosives as well. On the other hand, China is not Russia. The Chinese clearly have been embarrassed by this conflict. Putin obviously lied to President Xi when he was in Beijing shortly before the Olympic Games and told Xi that he had no intention of invading Ukraine. The Chinese are very hesitant about any violation of sovereignty because think of Taiwan. Sovereignty is their big guiding principle in international diplomacy. I think they would be much happier if this war would end. And they've actually appointed a peace envoy. Yes, a Chinese diplomat has been appointed and he's been in Kiev and Moscow trying to mediate, which shows that the Chinese, I think, are sincere when they in saying that they would like to broker some kind of solution. The war has been good for them in a sense that they've got Russia over a barrel. Russia now needs China much more than China needs Russia, and so the Chinese have been getting Russian oil and gas at bargain basement prices, which has been good for their economy. By the way, they're not particularly happy with the Russia abrogating today the Black Sea grain deal because the Chinese import quite a lot of their grain from Ukraine and would like that to go ahead. So what I'm saying is, yes, you're right. The Chinese have pulled closer together, more closely together with Russia, but there are still chinks in the armour, which the West can exploit to make China take a more even-handed position. And you see, for example, in the last couple of weeks, after a cool period in US-Chinese relations, that Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen have been in Beijing. John Kerry, the climate envoy, is there today. So I think the United States in particular and the Europeans are trying to build bridges with China, knowing it's going to be difficult, but knowing that there are, as I said, those differences of opinion between Beijing and Moscow that can be exploited, and where they do exist, if we can exploit them, so we should.
Russia having suspended the UN brokered grain deal to allow exports of tens of millions of tons of Ukrainian food via the Black Sea. The US Secretary of State has accused Russia of weaponizing food. How serious do you think this is? How concerned are you about it?
Well, I think everybody's concerned because it took the UN and Turkey such an enormously long time to negotiate this deal in the first place. Russia has never been happy with it. It took a long time before Moscow came on board last year. Russia has been also interfering with its implementation by holding up the inspections of ships which of course have slowed down the ability of Ukraine to export its grain. But Ukraine did succeed in getting 21 million tons out under the deal. And of course, if you're director of the World Food Programme, looking at Egypt, looking at Sudan, looking at drought and famine in Eastern Africa, this is a lifeline, because much of the Ukrainian grain does go to those regions of the world. I think, to be frank, on the other hand, there's a certain degree of hypocrisy in what Putin is saying, because last year Russia exported 46 million cubic tons of grain under, despite economic sanctions, which is the greatest amount so far in its history. So this deal, despite what Putin often says, isn't, if you like, denying Russia its markets, because food is not subject to the international sanctions. I personally believe that after sort of flexing his muscles, Putin will come back into the deal. I think for three big reasons. Very briefly, number one, because he will lose the global south if he doesn't. And Putin likes to be the hero of the global south, getting South Africa and Egypt and other countries to condemn NATO and the United States. He won't want to be unpopular, particularly if he's going to turn up at the BRICS summit in South Africa in August. Number two, he wants to keep a good relationship with Turkey, and he knows that for Turkey, that deal is an important diplomatic triumph, and the Turks do not want to lose it. And number three, I think the West has shown some signs recently of accommodating Russia, particularly in allowing a Russian bank which manages Russian grain exports, called the Russian Agricultural Bank, to be relinked to the international SWIFT banking system. Sorry about the technical stuff here, but it's important, of course, if you're dealing with this. And therefore, Putin will be able to claim a few concessions. I think he'll come back into the deal because I think, as I said, he's got more to lose by looking like the bad guy who's torpedoed it than by moaning about it but staying within it, which is what he was doing up until now.
Just if we could return to NATO's caution over the handling of Russia after it invaded Ukraine. The Times has received a letter from the former president of Georgia. This is Mikhail Saakashvili, who's in prison in Georgia. He says President told him 20 years ago of his intentions to seize Ukraine, but the West wasn't taking him seriously when he reported this to them. Is there a degree of naivety, do you think, amongst countries who adhere to the concept of rules-based order?
Uh, well, I mean, the rules-based order is never going to be perfect, but the fact it's like anything, the fact that there are criminals doesn't mean to say that we sort of throw away the criminal code into the wastebasket because certain people violate it, because we would be in a far worse situation. And if there are no rules, there's no way of judging people for breaking the rules, of course. So I continue to be a supporter of that so-called rules-based order. I think that Ukraine probably is a good example where the West has tried to uphold that by helping the Ukrainians, by trying to set up a tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggressive war, for instance, through dealing with the impacts of the war, through helping with food supplies and so many other things. In the case of Georgia, it's a sorry tale, really, because back in 2008, NATO invited Georgia to join NATO at the same time that it invited Ukraine. And for many years, of the two countries, Georgia seemed to be the one that was taking reform more seriously and would join NATO first. But unfortunately, with the current government looking more to Russia, there's been a certain degree of backsliding. And in a way, Georgia has fallen off the NATO map somewhat, which I regret, because there are a lot of very, very, very brave people in Georgia, Kate, who recently demonstrated on the streets to stop the government imposing a law which would have called foreign NGOs, sort of government agents or foreign agents. And that was rescinded. So whatever the Georgian government does, I think the Georgian population overwhelmingly look west, and we have to find ways of encouraging them to stay on that particular course.
The war in Ukraine has had a huge impact on NATO, its membership, and the relationships between its members. How would you sum it up?
Well, I think, like all wars, Kate, even just wars, it's been an unalloyed catastrophe. If you think so far, after 1 year of fighting, the Western estimates are about 250,000 soldiers have lost their lives. More on the Russian side. The Ukrainians, of course, have been discreet, but have lost a lot as well. We have a situation where 25% of the agricultural land of Ukraine has been destroyed. We've had threats of a new Chernobyl in terms of the sabotage of Zaporizhzhia. We've seen environmental crime on a massive scale. For example, the destruction of the dam. Recently, 18% of the Ukrainian housing stock has been destroyed. The World Health Organization calculates that 40% of Ukrainians, particularly children, will suffer permanent psychological damage from the war and will require sort of care costing billions probably for the rest of their lives to overcome the trauma. Ukraine has lost 7 million of its best people. An opinion poll recently showed that the majority of the Ukrainians in Germany want to stay in Germany. Good for Germany, but not good news to reconstitute Ukrainian society. There'll be lots of men in Ukraine, but not so many women at the end of the war. And in terms of social composition, that is going to be quite serious. You've had the children that have been deported and so on. I could go on reeling off the statistics, the 1/3 fall in GDP. But, you know, this isn't like any kind of aggressive war, a catastrophe for Ukraine. But also you've seen how quickly this type of war can ricochet across the world. We were talking about famine, food prices, energy prices, supply chains, inflation, everything. And so the lesson of this is that anything we can do to shore up deterrence and make it less likely that we will have these type of wars in the future, the better for all of us. You have to resist when this happens, but nobody can claim that the Ukrainian war somehow is a good thing for Western civilization. I wouldn't be able personally to accept that case.
And what about the impact on NATO?
Well, it's given NATO a new lease of life. There's no doubt about it in terms of NATO returning to collective defence. Obviously, in Vilnius, there were many decisions made on increasing defence spending up to 2% of GDP in the long run, new military plans, countries like Germany, Canada deploying more forces, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, which would not have happened without the war in Ukraine. So it's certainly given NATO sort of a degree of sort of raison d'etre in terms of going back to its original mission of collective defence. But that said, if you ask me as a former NATO official, and if you ask, you know, most NATO ambassadors privately over a glass of whiskey in the evening, you know, would you rather have this NATO today, which of course is very much in the front line because of the war in Ukraine, or go back to the NATO of 1989 when the Berlin Wall was coming down and we were opening up to Central and Eastern Europe and constructing partnerships in a less dangerous world? All of us would much rather be back in 1990 with that world of partnership and opportunity, not the world of defence and deterrence, which regrettably has been imposed upon us.
Dr. Jamie Shea, it's been great talking to you. Thank you for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you very much, Kate, for the opportunity.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.